This is a re-recording of the ARPA Community Kickoff Forum from the City of Somerville, which originally took place on Wednesday, October 27th. We're going to go over some information on what ARPA is and frequently asked questions. So we'll start with our welcome and introductions, give an overview of what is ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, update on what ARPA spending entails. We'll go through the community engagement process that we'll be undertaking this winter, discuss how projects get funded and how you can get involved. In the original forum, we did a discussion session, and so we will be using the log of questions and be presenting some of those questions along with the answers to preserve all of that information. And so for a couple introductions on us, here in the city of Somerville, we have the ARPA director, Austin Faison, as well as the ARPA specialist, that's me. And we will be on the team in the city to answer your questions, help you with applications, and generally shepherd through the process.
Thank you, Erica. And so we are the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We are working with the City of Somerville on outreach and engagement for this project. We are the regional planning agency to the 101 cities and towns in Metro Boston. Our mission is to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. And we've been working with our municipalities on figuring out and really guiding them through this ARPA process. At MEPC, we have a staff of 5 community engagement specialists, and myself, as well as Christian Brand, are the 2 MEPC staffers that will be working on this project. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so let's get into what is the American Rescue Plan Act. So the American Rescue Plan Act, shortened to ARPA, was signed into law in March of 2021. And so there are a number of different titles and lots of different funding segments, but overall, this is designed to be a COVID recovery bill, different than the earlier relief bills. And so we currently have the interim final rule and a fact sheet. We've also got a compliance document telling us about how the funds can be spent and how all the funding sources work. We are still waiting on the final rule, but hopefully that will be coming through shortly. And so overall, the timeline is that funds have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and then they can be fully spent by the end of December 31st in 2026. So we do have a couple of years over which we can be approving projects and spending funds. And so within Somerville, we were allocated a total of $77.5 million. There comes from 2 places. They're treated the same, but just for transparency and understanding. So about 62 million came directly to the city. About 16 million is allocated to us via Middlesex County. And since we don't have a county government in that way, that portion comes directly to the city. So for the state and local fiscal recovery funds, the portion that me and Austin are really looking at with us today, we have 77.5 million to spend. So there are 4 major categories of eligible uses for these funds. The first is responding to the public health emergency. This is pretty broad, ranging from testing and vaccination and strictly public health interventions to serving the hardest hit communities and working against the negative impacts economically that COVID has brought to our community. Other categories include premium pay, making sure that essential workers have been paid well for their services, revenue loss, making sure that the government has enough funds for services, given that there's been such a reduction in revenue over the pandemic. And finally, investments in infrastructure, which are very specific to sewer, water, and broadband infrastructure. There are, of course, always places we can't use the funds. So we can't reduce taxes using this funding pot of funding. We can't create deposits into a pension fund. We also can't, hold the funds for a rainy day or for the future and hang on to them. We've got to be spending them. We also can't use them for debt servicing. And so, as I mentioned, responding to the public health emergency is a really broad category. So here are some of the different elements that can be funded under that category. We can be looking at making sure that our public sector is fully staffed. We can be making sure that the public health infrastructure is there and that we've got everything we need to continue responding to the COVID pandemic. But we've also got more social determinants of health type of opportunities. And so looking at aid to address food, housing, or financial insecurity, the category of aid to disproportionately impacted communities, also discussed as hardest hit communities in the guidance, which can include, funding for childcare, interventions, healthy childhood environments, and other social determinants of health type of opportunities. Sorry, I covered that early. Here is a little more on all of that. A couple more examples. Community health workers could be something that we want to fund. Various types of housing services, youth services, and educational disparities.
Great, thank you so much, Erica. So in this project, we also want to make sure that we have an inclusive and equitable engagement process. Next slide. So we're hoping to really have a very transparent process. We kicked everything off back in September with a presentation to the City Council. We've since had some focus groups and engagement of municipal staff. When we've started to put together an ARPA website that did go live last month. We have today's forum presenting information on ARPA and giving information on how the funds can be used. And I will also be talking about some other tools that we have on the website to collect feedback. We will be meeting with community members. We will be doing focus groups throughout the rest of the fall and into the winter. We will also have an online survey that can be shared for wider feedback. And in the beginning of the year, we'll have a forum, a follow-up forum to this forum, as well as another survey. By the spring, we should have collected most of the information from various constituents throughout the city, and we will have a final summary to present to the city in June. Next slide. So the purpose of our engagement is to really develop a base of collective knowledge and learning about how ARPA spending can be used in the city of Somerville. We want to engage key stakeholders and residents in conversations around ARPA funding and have an additional focus on populations hardest hit by the pandemic and its economic impacts, including communities of color, renters, low-income residents, and non-English speaking residents. We understand the city is a very diverse city, and we want to make sure that we have engagement of different populations. We want to explore community priorities and how the funding should be used. And we want to make sure to share everything that we've heard with city staff so that decisions can be made. Next slide. The engagement activities that we'll focus on will provide clear and accessible information about the funding that Somerville is receiving, including what money can and cannot be used for certain activities. We'll also be communicating the city's priorities and what funding went to the initial emergency spending. We'll be creating opportunities for residents to share priorities and program suggestions with the city to further inform ARPA spending. Next slide. Language accessibility is very important for this process. We have a 12-person multilingual outreach team that meets people where they are. This outreach team also includes youth, local youth from the city of Somerville. We will have meetings that have interpreters and translated materials. We'll have clear information that's easy to understand at our engagements and at our events. We'll make sure to do targeted outreach and engagement and focus on communities that, as I said, have been hardest hit by the pandemic, have been maybe underrepresented, and also have resources to share that can be addressed through ARPA money. Next slide. We have today's kickoff forum, and we will do another forum in the beginning of 2022. We will also be reaching out to community leaders and gathering strategic partnerships to help with the outreach and engagement. We will be doing a series of focus groups from now into the winter, and we will be attending meetings or attending events and trying to get as much feedback as possible. And we also have 2 surveys that will be going out right now, initially in November into December, and then there will be another one following the next forum in February. Next slide. So what are some of those big ARPA questions that you have? I'm going to pass it on to Erica.
Great, thanks. So one of the biggest questions, how will this funding be spent? So there are a number of different paths that we're going to follow. So there are actually a few projects with emergency COVID needs that are being funded right now. And so in that case, it was high priority for us to move a couple of these projects through immediately, but there's still the vast majority of funding is still available. And then for upcoming projects, what we want to do is understand existing needs, and the city and its partners have a number of needs assessments and city plans, thinking about summer vision, climate forward, food system assessment, a number of others that identify community needs. And we want to be able to use those to inform our work moving forward. And of course, community projects and community values identified through the engagement process and through conversations like today. So we'll be using emergency need, identified community needs, and the values through the engagement process to inform how funding gets spent. So a couple of those projects that I mentioned that are being funded right now, primarily public health programs, emergency housing assistance, some of those community outreach workers that Emily mentioned, childcare and youth opportunities, hand sanitizer in parks, and of course, administration costs, making sure that we have our interpreters and translators available, and ensuring that we can go through this process properly. And so similarly, these are kind of the categories that will help us choose projects. We want to consider the need and emergency needs, the longstanding community needs, the public values and feedback, as well as project readiness. Is this a project that's ready to roll once the funding is approved, or is this something that needs a lot more legwork and development? These will influence decisions. We don't want to say that, of course, that projects that are still being developed will not be funded. Of course, that's not the case, but we want to work together on making sure that a great project is developed. So we will work with you to come up with your ideas, develop them, and then once they are truly ready to get started, then we can look at the funding.
All right, so I am, just to sort of like tie all of that together, we just wanted to be really clear about how you can expect your feedback to factor into decisions that the city's making with ARPA money. So like we said, public values about ARPA spending will help guide the city's decision-making process. And so you can sort of think about it as a funnel where your feedback is the structure of the funnel. And so that's really sort of like helping us narrow so that we get to the point where projects will be able to be funded. So in addition to that, things that were sort of going into the funnel and melding with your feedback are department priorities, emergency needs like Erica was mentioning, previous processes like summer vision. And so those things are all being considered in the mix, and your feedback is sort of providing the structure for understanding the boundaries of all these things. And then of course, a big question is how ready is this project to get started? It might seem like to the 2024 or 2026 is pretty far in the future, but from a municipal funding perspective, that's kind of like a blink or a blip, as it were. So one big consideration that the city is going to be taking into account is if this money is provided, can the project get started? And if the answer to that is yes, then the answer to that is let's fund it. So this is kind of like how you can think about the feedback influencing the process. It's not the only thing that is going to be taken into consideration by the city, but it is a really important element of understanding what projects will get to the bottom of the funnel. They have to meet these other, they have to connect with these other priorities as well. But that is kind of a description of how you can expect your feedback to influence what decisions end up getting made. So we also wanted to just quickly go over how you can share your ideas with the project team. And so I think the best place to start for this is the project website, which is somervillema.gov/ARPA. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So essentially, this is the project website. At the top, it has some information about the ARPA Act. That's redundant, but about the American Rescue Plan Act. It has information about the coronavirus and state and local fiscal recovery fund. And so, you know, it's important to note that the state is also getting its own ARPA funding from the federal government, and that money is currently being figured out, like the state is currently figuring out how to spend that money now, just like Somerville is. And so some of that money might have implications for opportunities and resources for the city. And then of course, Somerville is not the only municipality in the area getting ARPA funding. Almost every municipality is. And so, you know, neighboring cities like Cambridge and Medford and Arlington are all getting ARPA money as well. So this is kind of like a good place to go for updates on what the city is doing, more information about ARPA as we learn more from things like the final rule being announced. It's also useful to note that there's just an infrastructure bill that was passed by the federal government. And so that will have implications for the types of projects that cities and towns across the country will want to fund as well. So as you can see, it has some more information about what types of money and from where. It has a summary of all the things that we talked about today. But the one thing that I do want to show you today is that it does include this interactive budget survey. And this is not, of course, the only way that you can provide feedback, but it is a really useful way, I think, for understanding what kinds of decisions the city will be making based on the categories that ARPA has provided us. So each of these, in the budget tool, you'll find each of these different categories here. So the first one is supporting the public health response. And if you click on it, it will expand below to contain two subcategories. And you can add money to that by percentage. So you can say, I would like for 50% of the ARPA funds to be spent on mitigating the spread of COVID. And as you can see, that sort of colors in the total allocated amount at the top. And if you think that serving the hardest hit communities and families Investing in housing and neighborhoods should be 25%. You can add that there. Promoting healthy childhood environments, that could be the other 25%. And so there you've fully allocated all 100% of the ARPA funding that the city has available. So we really encourage you to go here and sort of play around with the tool. I think it's a good reflection of the types of decisions and prioritization that the city will have to make in order to effectively spend this money. But it also gives us a little bit of information about what your priorities are. Because all of this information, once you go down to the bottom, you have the opportunity to add a statement that just adds a little bit more context to what you've decided. And then once you say you're not a robot and fill out the reCAPTCHA, you can click next and it will send in the information to the city and record that. So that's the project website. And just as one last final note, any of the other sort of opportunities, forums, surveys, anything like that will be posted on this project website. So if you want to stay abreast of what's happening with the city and with ARPA, this is the place to go. So I have it bookmarked on my browser. I would recommend that you all do the same. All right. So we're going to get into discussion time, and like Eric mentioned at the beginning, these are questions that were asked of us and that we answered at the live forum on October 27th. And so we're just going to take those questions and go through them again. So these will be the same questions that we were asked and that we answered in the live forum, and we're just going to reproduce that for you here. All right, so for the Q&A discussion portion of today, we are going to just get started with some questions that we got about youth and ARPA funding. So the first question I'll direct to Erica is, are youth workers delivering behavioral health services considered community health workers?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to look into that further. I believe that the community health worker designation is usually a more formal title. And so I will have to look into exactly who qualifies, especially thinking about the final rule that will eventually be coming. So I hope that that will be addressed there, and we'll get back to you about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. And that is the same answer for our youth workers, essential workers who can receive premium pay, I'm assuming. Great.
Yes, there's still more to find out about from the final rules, and the Treasury will be able to give us, hopefully shortly, a document that details all of the exact pieces there.
Wonderful, thank you. So we got a bunch of questions about how people can access the funding. And so the first one is, how will this process encourage and respond to applications for projects that span multiple categories?
That's a great question also. One of the things that I'm really excited about is being able to work with everyone to be creative about our projects. And so you'll see later in the winter when the application is available, that the way that it works is that you can only choose one category out of 7, and then you can choose your specific subcategory for the project. Even though there may be some places where, you know, in a thinking from my public health background, that you'd want to be working on many elements and, you know, really spreading around to different categories. I understand that. You'll apply under one core category, but then you can start to branch out a little bit from there. And we can work together to make sure that as you do so, that you're still meeting all of the application requirements and the reporting requirements, which is really the key element here. But we do have some flexibility in being able to respond to creative projects that may work across categories. We can also help facilitate partnerships and join up separate projects that meet an overarching goal. So I think there's some exciting possibilities for us about multiple category projects.
And Erica, would you say that methodology that the city is working off of almost sort of prioritizes projects that span multiple categories of or impact lots of different communities.
Yes, thank you. I would say so. I think that we can have a stronger impact, a deeper impact, when we really look outside of our silos, and we can think about how multiple projects fit together, or how multiple categories come together. I think that gets at the realism of the way systems work in our community. So that's definitely a value for me, and something that I want to be able to facilitate with our applicants, that we can be connecting and overlapping to create a really exciting kind of intervention
Awesome.
group. Mhm.
Thanks, Erica. So another question that we got about accessing funding is, can subcontractor wages be controlled by labor agreements reached through community processes?
Yes. So I'll be honest that there's more I have to learn about the very specifics here, but I will say that in the compliance document, there are requirements for specifically the infrastructure projects, places where construction is happening that do trigger the Davis-Bacon Act and Baby Davis-Bacon Acts. And so part of the reporting requirements and part of the application requirements for projects with construction occurring and other labor occurring is that we have to provide some documentation about prevailing wages, looking at labor agreements for sure. So that does seem to be the case, and we can discuss the specifics with an applicant in that section, but the answer, I believe, is yes.
Great. So the last question about accessing funding is, how will this process address procurement laws without a formal RFP? How will funds get to the public without a formal RFP?
Sure. So we will have a detailed application process with all of the questions, really coming from the guidance at the federal level. The application, as I mentioned a little bit, will, get through all of the basics of your information, of the information of the applicant, the project background, justification, budget, timeline, the standard stuff. Then, as I mentioned, choosing a category and a subcategory that meets the compliance document requirements. And then there may be some extra information that's required. Again, maybe it's the Davis-Bacon or a couple other reporting requirements that are possible. So the application process is going to be detailed. And if there are we also require a budget breakdown. And so in there, we will be using the information that you provide to make sure that procurement laws are certainly met. If there's contracting required, depending on the cost level, et cetera, certainly going to bid that out as appropriate. Our procurement processes still apply to the funding and the distribution of funds once they're available. So even though this process may look a little bit different than others, we still will have a formal application process. And within that, just getting back to the community engagement, our statement of community values that have been put together after this process that we want people to keep in mind, and other guiding documents that we want applicants to keep in mind as they fill out their application.
Awesome, thanks, Erica. So we got a couple of questions about project requirements. So the first one is, how directly does a project need to be connected to COVID? And how creative can we be about what gets funded?
Thanks. So there are two really big requirements for funding. One is that it meets one of the categories and subcategories, and the other that are designated by the government, and the other that has a direct connection to COVID recovery. And one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is that it seems like we can be fairly innovative, our favorite word here in Somerville, about connection to COVID. I'm coming from a public health background and thinking about how COVID is so much more than just a health issue, a biomedical health issue. It has so many ripples through society. And I think that we will be able to prove and justify, that there can be very broad ripple effects from COVID that then require funding to ameliorate those impacts. So I do think that we can be pretty creative on how we think about COVID connection, tapping into our social determinants of health, et cetera. Though I will say that the infrastructure, as exciting as that category is very specific. So that's the one where I'll say we have less latitude, because it really must be water system improvements, sewer system improvements, and broadband accessibility with very specific upload and download speeds. So that one's narrow. But in terms of the earlier categories, hardest hit communities, negative economic impacts, and public health, I think we can really get broad there.
Awesome, thanks. So another question that is pretty related to this, I think, is how much does the fact that this is federal money, or that the source of this money is the federal government, how much does that determine or constrain the use of these funds? So in this question, the person says, for example, could we propose a safe injection site for Somerville?
Yeah, that's a great question that I don't have an answer to yet. And that's something that will be really important to look into. That particular example has been a really big discussion, a very important one. And we will have to explore with teams across the city exactly what the federal source of these funds means for projects like that. So we will be checking in on that.
Awesome. All right, so we got a bunch of questions about the community engagement process. So I'm going to turn these over to Emily. And so the first one is, how will this process engage a diverse range of Somervillians, and in particular, more than just white people who live in Somerville?
Excellent. Thank you so much for that question. So MAPC and the City of Somerville are forging and utilizing partnerships with organizations and community groups that already have existing relationships in the community, deep connections, and really, trust with diverse populations. And so we'll be making sure to work with as many organizations as possible to have the broadest reach. Our strategy is to go where residents already are, attend meetings that already exist, or gatherings, instead of asking residents to come to us, and making sure we're utilizing different methods of collecting information. We're also exploring incentives for residents to participate in focus groups as a way to diversify the people that participate and share feedback.
Awesome, thanks, Emily. So another question, we got a bunch of versions of this, and so sort of summarizing them all into one is, how will you engage my community group?
So we have a list of organizations that represent different parts and geographies of the city. We actually are also took note of all the people that attended the forum, and a bunch of people actually in the chat volunteered themselves as organizations that really wanted to participate in that outreach and engagement. If you are part of an organization or a community group, or even just a resident that would like to aid in reaching your community members, please, please, please contact us, and so that we can work together on making sure we have diverse outreach. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So in addition, we got another question that is, how will you support community dialogue that doesn't pit ideas and residents against one another?
So this is what we like to say, not a zero-sum game. It's 77 million of found money for the city. We want to hear all ideas, and we're using this engagement moment to really do that. So we're not trying to have people be competitive in this moment, and just really have an open door to hear as many ideas and perspectives as possible.
Awesome. All right, so we got a question about language accessibility. So will forms for this project be created in languages other than English?
So the application on the website that you showed previously will not, as of this moment, is not in another language, it's in English. However, the background information that we are presenting will be in multiple languages, as well as the 2 surveys that we mentioned. If you have a project idea that you want to submit and would like assistance with, please contact our ARPA specialist, Erica Seton Hernandez, and she will be able to maybe provide you with a little bit more assistance.
Awesome. So one question we got is about the community survey versus the budget tool we showed earlier. So how do they differ from each other, and what information will these tools capture, and how will that be used?
Sure. So the budget tool really allows us to collect a general understanding of what people feel this funding should go to. But the survey will be an opportunity to give us more specifics. And so we'll have more open-ended questions there. And we'll make sure to sort of use both tools as ways of understanding what residents want. Mm-hmm. So they are different, just 2 different ways of collecting information.
Great. All right, so going back to our questions about youth earlier, this one is, will young people be included among those considered disproportionately impacted?
Yes, absolutely. The city of Somerville has a very large youth population, and so we definitely want to make sure we're engaging youth in this process. We're working with the Somerville Office of Immigrant Affairs as well, who's hired or is about to hire, I think, some youth engagement folks as well. So stay tuned on that.
Awesome. And then sort of related to that is, how will you be soliciting and incorporating meaningful and authentic youth voices during this process?
As I just said, we are going to try to be providing some sort of stipend to local youth to help us do further outreach and engagement. And we are trying to identify youth organizations to also be able to spread the word. If anybody, listening to today, also maybe from the schools would like to help us with this initiative, please definitely reach out.
Awesome, thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
So we've got a bunch of questions about decision making. And so the first question in this sort of area is, who ultimately determines how the funds will be used?
Great. So technically, the legislation is written such that decision-making ends with the executive office. As we mentioned in the presentation, there are a lot of ways that we'll be looking at applications and funding methodology and making those recommendations to the executive office.
And by executive office, Erica, you mean the mayor's office, correct?
Yes, thank you. Yes, sorry.
So what is the timeline for this process, and by when will funding decisions need to be made?
Yeah, so we're working on this engagement process going through next spring. And what's pretty neat about ARPA funding is that it can be made, funding decisions can be made on a rolling basis. We're looking just for now at kind of the emergency needs and starting to open up closer to the end of the engagement process for larger scale projects. And again, the funds that are approved must be obligated by the end of 2024. That applies to all projects, and for some of those really big ticket items where you may be spending over a couple of years, think about those infrastructure projects as an example. you may have obligated funds by then and then still be spending by 2026.
So we did get a bunch of questions about sort of specific uses of funding. And so the first one is, will some of ARPA funds be used to address Somerville's rat infestation?
Sorry, my dog has decided to join us today, which is so exciting. So yes, the rats. You know, we again will be thinking about a link to COVID, and one of the other requirements for certain projects, not all, is that they want to have projects that fall into qualified census tracts as defined by HUD. So making sure that recipients are low income, and again, connecting back to what would be defined as hardest hit communities. So probably if it fits within a qualified census tract and we can make a reasonable link to COVID, we could possibly fund it. But again, we'd really just need to think about what that link is, and make the appropriate argument for that.
Awesome. So another question about a specific use is, will any funds be dedicated to public safety and violence intervention?
They certainly can. You know, we're hearing from different communities around the country, looking at other examples of how people are spending their ARPA funds. This could fit into revenue replacement. This could maybe fit into the public health category. And so there are definitely possibilities for that. And, you know, examples including sending public health or mental health response teams to emergency calls. That's something that we're interested in and that we're hearing from other communities as well. So those are some possibilities for sure.
Awesome. So another question is, will the school district receive extra funds through this process?
So they are going to receive funds through a different title within ARPA. And so, you know, the larger ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, has a number of titles and a ton of different programs. Ours is a specific subset, and the schools is in a different pot of funding. So they will have their own process. School-related funding won't fall into the category that we're doing here, but that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that I guess that's separating school district and youth in general. So as we talked about earlier, there are definitely funding opportunities for making sure youth are best served in COVID recovery, but school district specific funding will not be included.
Awesome. And so we got another question: can ARPA funds be used to rehabilitate older buildings?
That's definitely a possibility. You know, we have a lot of discussion. We had a lot of discussion in the earlier forum and across the community about a community center. That's definitely something that we know people are interested in. And again, you know, could have a compelling argument for connection to COVID, and could be a highly have a deep impact in that project. So definitely possible.
Awesome. And Erica, can you just speak a little bit to how much of the $77.5 million has already been obligated?
Yeah, so at this point, the emergency projects that we mentioned are only accounting for about $1 million of the funding. So plenty is certainly left.
Awesome. All right. So we're reaching the end of our Q&A. So really quickly, we have a couple of questions about nearby municipalities and regional considerations. So the first one is, are there opportunities to use these funds to collaborate with neighboring municipalities? And I'll turn that over to Emily.
Absolutely. However, this depends, you know, on the appetite of other municipalities. Since we are MAPC, we can share with the city what we're hearing from other municipalities, and you know, can support collaboration if that's something that's an opportunity.
Awesome. And then another question that we got specific to this is, what if nearby municipalities use this funding to increase pay for things like fire departments, teachers and nurses, and that sort of leads to that labor force leaving Somerville for higher paying jobs.
So supporting sort of the increase of pay for employees that do essential work is part of the eligible uses. That will be something the city should consider in its decision making and could be a possibility.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so we have one final question that's kind of a big one, and that is about accountability. And just to note, the forum that we originally held was on October 27th, which, as you know, is before the election. We are now after the election, so that will make sense once I tell you what the question is. But the question is, what mechanisms and relationships will exist to hold the city accountable if community members are not seeing their ideas being honored or implemented? And then sort of on top of that, how will the planning process reckon with the upcoming mayoral administration change? And like, is the incoming mayor expected to honor what this current administration's decisions are?
These are some of my favorite questions from in general. And, you know, in terms of accountability, some of the things that we're working on in that area is, you know, in the application, making sure that the statement of community values that's created through this engagement process, as well as the needs assessments and other reports on community needs are front and center in the application, such that, and I'll be writing that application to make sure that that's in there, so that we can ensure that all applications are submitted with a compelling community need and a tie to the community values that have been identified. We also, in our scoring rubric, which will be uploaded in the application along with those resources, make sure that that's public so that you can see how we're scoring our applications, making decisions, and including equity and identified community needs, weighing that very heavily in our scoring. And then in the future, you know, as community members are being able to see what's being applied and what's being approved, on the ARPA website, there will be a section going live soon where you can see approved projects and some project status. So you have a sense of where we're at with things, and our information is available and open. We want to hear from you. And if you're seeing a gap or seeing differences, let us know, and we want to be responsive to that. In terms of the mayor administration change, you know, there is a team of staff dedicated to creating a seamless transition between administrations. And, you know, what has been spent and projects that have been approved at this point are settled matters. But then, you know, the community engagement process and the information that we're gathering over this winter is really top priority, that we can be able to say, this is what the community wants. And we can present that to the incoming administration to make sure that we all share this great information and community values to make decisions with. Yes.
Awesome. All right, so that is all of the questions that we had for during the forum. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly and do a little bit of a closeout. So there are a few ways that you can stay involved in this process. So the first one is probably the best, and that is to join the city's mailing list to get notifications about community events and forums. So this includes other things in addition to ARPA. And I'm sure some of you are already on this list, but our upcoming ARPA opportunities will be part of this mailing list. And that is accessible at www.somervillema.gov/newsletter. And then, like I said earlier, we really encourage you to visit the project website and use the budget tool, and then respond to any of the other surveys and engagement opportunities that are posted there. And you can do that at somervillema.gov/ARPA. We will be providing the opportunity to schedule some office hours with ARPA staff. That is coming soon, and again, will be on the project website. And then if you have the opportunity, please consider participating in a focus group with a local community organization. If you're connected to a community organization, like Emily was saying earlier, feel free to reach out to us and see if we can do a focus group session. We're very interested in meeting folks where they're at and coming to organizations, and would love to come to yours. So those are all the ways that we can stay involved. Emily and Erica, any last notes?
Thank you, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.